Okay, Bruchim Haba, welcome everyone. Today's learning is dedicated by the Levitzin family in honor of the yahrzeit of the Bas Ayin, Yud Beis Kislev, in honor of Reb Ruvain's father-in-law's yahrzeit. Tei Nishmas Tzur B'Tzarachemo. I want to share with you some Lomdus on Parshas Vayishlach. We're all familiar with the words of Chazal. Yaakov Avinu says, "Im Lavan garti v'oichar arata." Chazal say, "Garti." Gematria Taryag. Yaakov Avinu was saying, I lived with Lavan and I fulfilled all 613 mitzvahs. To some degree that implies that only then Yaakov fulfilled all 613, and until then maybe he hadn't. Indeed, the Medrash Lekach Tov says that Yaakov Avinu said, I was Mekayim the whole Torah besides Kibbut Avayim and Peri Varivya, and with Lavan I was Mashlim the Taryag mitzvahs. So im Lavan garti, the Taryag mitzvahs shamarti, because now I was mekayim kibbut av and peri varivya. Like the pasuk says, Vayavoid Yisrael be'isha uve'isha shamar. He was shomer all the mitzvahs. The Sefer Chavetzas Hasharon explains that Yaakov Avinu was commanded both by his mother and his father to go to Padan Aram. Rivka says, Kum brach lecha Lavan achi, Charana. And Yitzchak said, Kum lecha Padana Aram Beisa Besuel. So it comes out that Yaakov Avinu going to Lavan was a fulfillment of both Kibbut Aim and Kibbut Av. So long as Yaakov was in Yeshiva Shem Be'ever, he was not fulfilling Kibbut Av Aim and Mitzvahs Peri Varivya. So now, the Medrash says, but in the house of Lavan, he was mashlim both. And that's why the Medrash quotes the pasuk, Uve'isha shamar, that by marrying a wife, he was Mekayim Peri Varivya and Kibbut Avayim. The Gemara in Megillah says that Yaakov Avinu was punished because he didn't serve his father for 22 years. That's mashma. He didn't fulfill Kibbut Av during those years. Furthermore, didn't Rivka say that he should live there until she calls him, and she only called him after 20 years. So my friend Dr. Yaakov Baim asked, that implies that Yaakov was not being Mekayim Kibbut Avayim during that time. But that's what his parents told him to do. Rivka even said, you should stay there until I call you. So we suggested that, and Chavetzas Hasharon brings this point as well, that because Yaakov Avinu delayed an extra 2 years, so that showed, in a way, he was doing it on his own. He was doing it because he wanted to do it. So that, so to speak, negated, and retroactively he was accountable for all 22 years. But that's how the Chavetzas Hasharon explains the Medrash, that with Yaakov Avinu going to get married, he was now mashlim two missing mitzvahs, namely Pru Uravu and Kibbut Avayim. Let's discuss a question that we've spoken about in the past. There's a famous machlokes. We know that only Yaakov Avinu is considered Zera Avram. The Mishnah in the Darim says that if someone makes a neder from Zera Avram, they're Aser in Bnei Yisrael and they're Mutter B'vnei Esau. But is Esau considered Zera Yitzchak? We know Esau is not Zera Avram. Ki bi Yitzchak yikar lecha zara. Only in part of Yitzchak are the descendants of Avram. But is Esau considered Zera Yitzchak? That's a machlokes. The Rivash in Siman Lamed Ches says, Esau is not only not Zera Avram, he's not Zera Yitzchak. However, the Medrash in Parsha Ayin Vav, Parak Dalet, said that when Yaakov Avinu said, Vayomer Yaakov Elokei Avi Avraham Elokei Avi Yitzchak. What do you mean Elokei Avi Yitzchak? Yitzchak is also Esau's father. Hala Esau loy, the Medrash says. The Medrash says, Ela haboicher b'darcheim v'ha'oisa k'ma'aseyem ani miskayim alav. Misha einoi boicher b'darcheim v'einoi oisa b'ma'aseyem eini miskayim alav. Rav Shlomo Kluger in his Tshuvos in Yordeas and Reish Mem Daud explains that the Medrash is asking, how could Yaakov Avinu invoke the zechus of Yitzchak? Yitzchak is also Esau's father. To which the Medrash answers that only someone who acts like Yitzchak could access the zechus of Yitzchak. And since Esau did not act like Yitzchak, he cannot invoke the zechus of Yitzchak. Says Rav Shlomo Kluger, this Medrash is a proof against the Rivash. Because the Medrash is saying that Esau should also be able to invoke the Zechus of Yitzchak. Presumably that means Esau, although he may not be Zera Avram, he's Zera Yitzchak. In fact, the Medrash doesn't ask how Yaakov could say Elokei Avi Avram. We know how he could say Elokei Avi Avram. Only Avram is the father of Yaakov. But Yitzchak is the father of Esau. The Medrash seems to be very clear, because it's only asking on how Yaakov Avinu could invoke Avi Yitzchak. No problem how he could invoke Avi Avram. Avram for sure is only Yaakov's father. And the answer, the Medrash seems to say, while indeed Yitzchak is Esau's father, Esau cannot utilize his merit. So the Rav Shlomo Kluger brings this Medrash as a proof that Esau is indeed Zera Yitzchak, although he may not be Zera Avram. Okay, now one last point. There's an amazing Tosfos in Kedushin Lamed Testament base. The Gemara says, Machshava ra ein HaKadosh Baruch Hu mitzarfa l'maisa. For the Jewish people, Hashem rewards for Machshava Tova, but He does not punish for Machshava ra. However, says Tosfos, by the Umayis Ha'olam, Machshava ra mitzarfa l'maisa. Says Tosfos, what's the source of this? Says Tosfos, the source of it is this week's Haftarah. It says in Oivadya, Mechamas achicha Yaakov techascha busha v'nichras la'olam. Because of the robbery of your brother Yaakov, you should be covered with shame and cut off forever. So Esau is being punished for the treachery that he did to Yaakov. Question to ask Tosfos: Esau did nothing to Yaakov. He didn't end up doing anything. It must be, why is Esau eternally cut off? Machshava ra chashav alav l'maisa. Must be that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is mitzaref by the Umayis Ha'olam machshava ra l'maisa. And that is the opinion of the Yushalmi, Parak Aleph, Halach Aleph. By the way, that seems to indicate, if we're learning out machshava ra, Hashem is mitzaref l'maisa from Esau, doesn't that prove that Esau was a Oved Avodah Zarah? Not like the Ramban, who brings a proof from the Gemara in Kedushin that says about Esau, V'dilma Yisrael Mumar Shani, that Esau had a din of a Yisrael, because here the Yushalmi and Tosfos is learning out that by Umayis Ha'olam, Hashem is Choshev Machshava Ra L'maisa. So the Pri Megadim, who's one of the greatest of the Poskim of the Achronim, you have the Noisei Kelim on Shulchan Aruch, and in the later generations, Pri Megadim is one of the most authoritative of the later Achronim, after the Noisei Kelim. Pri Megadim wrote a sefer of Lomdus on Chumash, in a similar style of the Parshas Drachim, but the Pri Megadim writes it in his very concise style. Pri Megadim wrote a sefer of Lomdus called Tevas Goimeh. And in the Tevas Goimeh, on this week's Haftarah, the Pri Megadim says, wait a second, we're going to bring a raya from Esau that Hashem is Choshev Machshava Ra L'maisa. Esau didn't even steal from his brother. He sent Eliphaz. So if he sent Eliphaz, so how can you say that Esau didn't actually do anything? Not only did he not do anything, he didn't think anything. He wasn't involved. It was all Eliphaz. How can we learn out from Esau? Esau sent a shliach. The Pri Megadim says, "L'chayra sheshalach Eliphaz achra v'natam amenu amaynai ushluchai kamaisai." In other words, the question is, Esau did do something. What? In other words, the Pri Megadim is asking that Esau. Now, the way the Chavatzalas Hasharon grips the Pri Megadim's question, the Pri Megadim's question, the Chavatzalas Hasharon, it says, is the truth is Esau did not actually steal anything from his brother. He sent Eliphaz, his agent. If you look in the Pri Megadim, it seems like what his question is that shluchai shel adam kamoisai. Now, the commentary Pesach HaTeva learns the question like the Chavetzel Hasharon. In other words, the question is that Esau did absolutely nothing. He sent Eliphaz. And the answer is shluchai shel adam kamoisai. And therefore, he did try to harm him. So, even though you could ask on that, well, if shluchai shel adam kamoisai, then he actually did it. Then he did steal, and you don't have a raya anymore. I would have said that's the actual question of the Pri Megadim. How could you learn out that machshava ra, Hashem is mitzaref l'maisa? It's not a machshava. Esau did it because shluchai shel adam kamoisai. So, since shluchai shel, I would say the question is, since shluchai shel adam kamoisai, then it's a maisa. The Chavetzel Hasharon and the commentary on the Pri Megadim says that that's the answer. Since shluchai shel adam kamoisai, we see that Esau wanted to do something. Then the Pri Megadim says, wait a second, ein shliach ledvar aveira. I would say ein shliach ledvar aveira is the answer. Since ein shliach ledvar aveira, now it's not a maisa anymore. Now it's just the desire. But I would say that's the answer. The Tevas Goyma says that's the Chavetzel Hasharon says that's the question. Ein shliach ledvar aveira. So since ein shliach ledvar aveira, so there's no shlichus and there's no machshava. But then he says, well, ein shliach ledvar aveira, that's only by a Yisrael, but by a Nachri, yesh shliach ledvar aveira. And then the Tevas Goyim says, well, by Goyim there's no shlichus whatsoever. There's no shlichus whatsoever. In any event, this is some of the Lomdus on the limud of Tosfos and the Yerushalmi, that machshava ra HaKadosh Baruch Hu is mitzaref l'maisa from the fact that Esau only thought to steal from Yaakov, but actually in the end he never accomplished anything. So Tosfos says that's a raya that machshava ra Hashem is mitzaref l'maisa, even though you could ask, well, shluchai shel adam kamoisai. It's interesting that the Pri Megadim entertains the possibility, well, is shluchai shel adam kamoisai because Eliphaz thought he was doing a mitzvah of kibbud avayim, to which the Pri Megadim says miman nafshach. If Eliphaz is a Jew, there is no kibbud avayim if your father tells you to do an avera, and if he's not a Jew, then there's no mitzvah of kibbud avayim b'chalal to goyim. To read to you the words of the Pri Megadim, v'oy dekoydem atatar miman nafshach. If they're b'nei noach, ein asay kibud l'man d'amra mizayin mitzvahs hu doicha l'leisasay gezal. Kibud avayim is not one of the Sheva mitzvahs, so it wouldn't be doicha gezal. Even though you could ask, we just came back from Morocco, one of the Gedolim of North Africa wrote the Mavoi Tashas, and in the intro to Shas, Rabbeinu Nisim Goin brings an idea that any mitzvah which is a mitzvahs sichliyos, Goyim are chayiv in, which would then come out, Goyim l'chayra are chayiv in kibbud avayim. In any event, this is some of the Lomdus of the Pri Megadim on this week's Haftarah, which Tosfos and Kedushin says serves as a source that for the Umayis Ha'olam, Hashem is mitzarif, machshava, ra'ah, l'maisa. Wishing everyone a wonderful day.